Thank you. Good morning. Can you guys hear me all right? Okay. So Flexera, my employer, approached me a while ago and said, "We want you to speak at BriForum." I said, "Really? What could I bring to BriForum that these guys don't even know?" So a little bit about my background. I'm a principal consultant with Flexera Global Services, and I've been with them just under a year. Prior to that, I was at a financial services organization for 16 plus years, and the last 6, 7 of those years I was leading our desktop transformation efforts. And so the material, and this material germinated from certainly my experience at a large enterprise, but it's also been vetted with a number of our Flexera's largest customers. And so in trying to figure out, what I could bring to the table and in terms of insight for you guys, it was around, a year ago I was sitting where you are right now, right, trying to eat up as much technical knowledge as I possibly could. And when looking back and going through our journey from a desktop transformation piece, I really wanted to do something around, okay, what were the stuff that I wasn't going to hear at one of these sessions or talking to vendors out on the floor. And so that's really around where this came from. That being said, one of the things that, in looking back what we did is we basically have come up with a desktop transformation, what I would call implementation cycle, right? And so the conversations around, we know what the bits and bytes are, we know what the processes are to get them in place, but how do you bring all of that together to truly implement desktop virtualization, whether it's a simple application virtualization, maybe it's Windows 7 with user virtualization, maybe it's a full-blown VDI. But some of these themes really came through. And so we're going to get into each one of these a little bit. And the other thing I would caution here as we get into it is that these can run parallel. They're not necessarily in the sequence. Organizations that we've talked to do them in a little bit different order, but the theme is pretty much the same. And so I think the key word on this is cycle, right? It's an evolution of a cycle, right? You're going to continually improve this through lifecycle management practices, through new use cases, through new applications, and so it never really ends, but certainly you got to start somewhere. So looking at this, starting from the top, we talk about rationale business objectives. Why are we going to do this? Right? Is this just cool stuff? Is it fun to do? Is there a true business need? Is it a strategy shift? Why are we going to do this, and what is the justification process we're going to have to go through? Then you get into use case normalization, right? I think we've all read and experienced and certainly are aware that when you start getting into the desktop virtualization technologies, one size doesn't fit all, right? You're not going to roll this out to a 48,000 user base with people doing who knows what and who knows how many different ways. So you're going to have to pick and choose. You have to understand what those use cases are. Then you get into, and again, sequence may vary, but then you get into the development of those solutions, right? What does it get into? What are we going to do? How are we going to architect this? What are the processes we're going to put in place to go around? You get into what I would call a migration inventory phase, where you really then need to get down granular, looking at the users. What are they using? Who's got the USB plugged-in blanket that they need to make sure works with the next iteration of the technology? What are the applications? How much data do they have? Where do they store it? Those sorts of things, and we'll get into it a little bit more. Finally, you get into the rollout plan and the resource plan, right? When are users available to go from a business calendar perspective? When are solutions going to be available? When are the applications going to be available? How do I scale it up? How do we resource it to make sure we have those pieces in place? Continuing to go into the build-out phase once we identify, okay, this is who's going when, doing the just-in-time, if you will, delivery of infrastructure or application input, that sort of thing. Finally, after you've got it built out and you've got it planned and you've got it tested, you get into that onboarding piece itself, right? The moment of truth. We're moving a user from X to Z or whatnot. And then finally, once they're on that new platform or platforms, you get into the ongoing, never-ending cycle of life cycle management. Does this ring a bell? Sound familiar? So when we look at solution components from a desktop transformation journey perspective, one of the things we found is that there's obviously a lot of consistency here, and each organization we talk to does it a little bit differently. This is a fairly complete picture in terms of what are the pieces, parts for an end-to-end very, pretty complete virtualization implementation, right? Whether you're using VDI, whether you're using WTS, whether you're doing a user virtualization, user profile virtualization piece, whether you're virtualizing applications, maybe you're doing a BYOD effort on that, you're bringing in tablets, maybe you're looking at thin clients, or maybe it's just, hey, we're going to Windows 7, we're looking at Windows 8, and we're going to virtualize apps with AppV. But bottom line is, no matter what those pieces parts are, you're going to have your own map. And so as we look at this, and there is a rationale to the color coordination on this, we really look at it starting from this middle piece. I'm going to start over here, right? And that's really, where does the computing take place, right? That what I would call a compute level. Where is the Excel spreadsheet and the data getting crunched, not necessarily being accessed, right? So you've got your traditional, maybe corporate workstation image. Windows XP's gone away, Windows 7 you're looking at, maybe Windows 8. And then you get into some of the client virtualization opportunities, right? Whether it's Blades or WTS or a virtual hosted VDI type scenario. On top of that, we then look at, okay, what is the user going to do? What are we doing with users? Is it going to be a local profile? Are we going to use some sort of degree of user personalization? There's a couple of pieces of that, right? It's the settings themselves, and then what are you going to do with the bits? Is there a home drive you're going to use? Are you going to provision storage for that? Are you going to use roaming profiles? So the whole conversation at the user level. You get into the application level going forward, and those are the bits and bytes. What are they using, right? They need to use Outlook. They need to use IE. Maybe it's a SaaS solution. And then finally, on top of that, are what I would call the access device layer, right? Is it a physical PC running that Windows 7? Is it a thin client? Is it an iPad? And of note over here, certainly we talk about phones and tablets and laptops. There's bleeding going on between the corporate-owned and the BYOC scenario. Finally, the bookends of this really talks about what we would call application preparation, right? The packaging of these applications or the virtualization, if that's a direction you're going to, of those applications, getting them prepared to be included into this environment. And then finally, on the right, once we have these environments built out and defined and the application's ready, we got to build the user migration processes, right? Whether that's USMT or something of that ilk. We talk about user migration up and down the stack. And then this is certainly built, each of these is built on a layer of systems lifecycle management, right? Whether that's your traditional SCCM, Altiris, PC-based or Windows-based workstations systems management solution, or now we're getting into MDM and how we're going to manage some of these mobile devices. You get into the software distribution, app provisioning aspect that those brings to the table, some of the patch management that we've historically had to deal with, and then certainly asset management doesn't go away in this model either. And so going forward, getting back into the cycle, what are some of the rationales and business objectives? And I think obviously a decision's been made, a need has been identified that you want to go down this. You want to go down this path, we need to bring in app virtualization. Certainly that's a key to understanding and bringing success for how you're going to go down your journey, right? You want to know why you're doing it, you need to figure out how you're going to do it, you want to do it in a cost-effective manner. I think the one caution, and this is certainly we can validate what we've been through and talking to a number of organizations. I think, the general consensus is desktop virtualization is not necessarily all about cost savings, right? If that's your number one driver, you might want to go back and take a look at it. There's certainly strategic shifts there that maybe you're going down. And certainly what we've been through and what our team experienced, that is exactly the case. You need to make sure that you're looking at not only the hard dollars, but also the soft benefits and some of the strategic directions you're going through around them. So, what are some of those complementary objectives? So we talk about consumerization of IT. Hey, we want to enable our end users to bring their iPads, their iPhones, their personal devices on campus. Maybe we want to get away from building embassies offshore, and we want to virtualize everything for our offshore developments and support staff. Security, you guys have heard all of this. Security around data. It's pretty easy to secure data within the confines of the data center and get out of kind of the laptop data management perspective. Patch, I don't have to worry about those laptops that maybe aren't connecting all of the time, but we can ensure they're patched because they're just accessing virtual devices within the confines of the data centers. Application management. Again, you look at that mobile, the historic Windows mobile conversation around how do I get these bits and bytes to partially connected, sometimes connected laptops. And so virtualization certainly can help with that, but also just the fact that you're playing within the same playground within the confines of your data center. Licensing. One of the things that we had looked at was the ability to have tighter control on our licensing. Again, by bringing it closer to the core of the infrastructure, certainly licensing and how you can provision who has access to what applications. There's an opportunity there to tighten that up. Provisioning, pretty simple to grant access to a Citrix application, right? You can add it to a security group and away you go. Business continuity. I know one of the things that we had looked at was that we didn't have a good business continuity perspective from a workstation platform, right? A lot of organizations look at it and say, yeah, we've got business continuity. We have a backup solution that's in place that maybe works part of the time. Well, that's a different story than saying, you know what, we've got virtual machines that we're replicating across data centers, and that's where we're doing these things, or user profile data. So there's a whole conversation around business continuity from a workstation. And there's certainly others. Going around the ring again, use case normalization, and this is one that we encourage early and often, right? Do it as soon as you can, the sooner the better. And there's really two pieces as we look at this. One is the user rationalization itself. And this is all about what are they doing, where are they doing it, what are the hours they use, what tools do they use, the applications themselves, how much CPU utilization are those applications taking, what are their peak times in terms of hardware utilization on that workstation. And then the other half of that's the application rationalization, right? We talk to a lot of organizations that say, okay, you know what? User group X has 300 applications that they have installed. Well, installed and used are two different things, right? Just because they still have Adobe 7 from who knows how many years ago doesn't mean they're necessarily using it. Let's make sure we get that Adobe 7 from who knows how many years ago out of the equation so we don't have to worry about it going forward. We don't carry that stuff, right? So obviously trying to figure out where they're installed. The second question is, are they being used? You know, and then as you go forward, you know, who owns these things, right? Who is that Adobe 7 reader or SME, internal SME, that makes a call that says, yeah, we can get this thing out of here, or no, we still need it. You know, and how do we get that thing virtualized, and where are we from a licensing perspective? So really understanding what the user is and what the application rationalization list is can really narrow down who are good candidates for whichever solutions you're bringing to the table. So this one really refers to that second diagram, and you see my rainbow of colors here, right? And then we get into the next phase, which is, okay, now we're doing the hardcore IT implementation piece, right? We're architecting, we're designing, we're testing, we're building. Certainly we talked about the compute layer, that user profile layer. We got decisions we got to make on each of these. That application layer, are we going to go local, partially locally install? Are we going to virtualize? Are we going to stream? The access device layer, do I need to build a Windows embedded image for a thin client? Am I going to go with just Windows 8? What are we going to do about the iOS aspect of this thing, or the Macs? The management layer, what pieces do I need to put in place there? Right? Do I need to put a thin client device management system in place, or an MDM solution? And certainly the bookends. What are we going to do around preparing applications? Do I need to get a new packaging or a virtualization tool? What do I need to do? What processes, pieces, and parts do we need to do from a user state migration perspective? What tools are we going to use? How are we going to do it? What's involved? And I think the other thing worth noting is that last bullet at the bottom there. You know, each of these in and of themselves is probably going to have their own support and operational readiness plan, right? And that's something you can't underestimate, right? You have to have SMEs. You've got to have the pieces, processes in place. How are you going to monitor these things if they go down? What's the redundancy plan look like? All of that applies for each of these layers. So migration, inventory, and preparation. And so now we're starting to get into, okay, we've done a high-level analysis. We've determined that these users using this application set can go. Let's take the next level and dive deeper into them, right? So from a hardware perspective, what are they using today? What do they need to go forward? What do they have? You know, does the PC they have today, are we just going to convert that into a glorified thin client? Or do they need new hardware? Or are they going to get a thin client? Or are we going to give them just an iPad? Right? So those decisions. Printers. Printers are fun, right? What are they using from a network perspective? Do they have something local, right? Do they still have something local? Is it something current, or is it one of those old HP 5Ls that still floats around occasionally? Peripherals, right? Peripherals are a challenge. Can't underestimate those. You know, somebody's got something plugged in that may not work in a XenApp environment or a VDI environment. We run into that. So doing that next level of detailed understanding of what they have from a hardware perspective. Then moving on to their data, their profile aspect. Where do they have their data? Do they have a home drive and a local store that they're using? If it's on that local hard drive, do they have it all in one place? Or are you going to have to put processes in place to consolidate and then move? And then how much is that, right? Is it just the call center guy that maybe has 5 meg worth of stuff and you're using email, a web-based email, or are they one of those guys like me that has 16 years worth of PST files at who knows how many gig that we're going to have to manage or figure out what we're going to do in that scenario. So looking at the data, where is it? Environmental. As you start bringing this stuff into the data center for VDI or XenApp, there are performance considerations, right? How many data centers do you have, and where are their applications running? There may be performance considerations that you need to take into account, right? I know we ran into more than a handful of situations where we had an old legacy client-server system that was running around, and they only had it in data center A. Well, we're building in A and B, so do I have to manage where these users are going to be from a primary data center location perspective? Right, so we talk about environmental. Those are the sorts of things that you got to take into account. Are there file shares in one location that they need? Right? Are they localized? What are we going to do about that? And that means I got to get the storage guys or the Windows Server guys involved. SharePoint sites. That was one that kind of came up and admittedly bit us. I said, yeah, we better figure out what we're going to do about SharePoint. Same deal. Where is it based? Is it replicated? Can we use it in 2 places? So certainly they need to take a look at the environmental piece. Application validation, we kind of talked about that, right? So you've done the rationalization piece, you've identified it. Are they still using it? Is it a corporate asset? Is it a personal asset? If we're allowing that, how are we going to deal with that? Do they still need it? Going over to the app prep, compatibility. Will this application run on a Citrix XenApp server? Is it app v5 compatible? Is my only hope that, it's not? Do I have to leave them on a Windows physical box? Does it work in a VDI maybe? So compatibility. We kind of talked through this a little earlier, performance compatibility, right? Are there performance considerations that we need to take into account if we're going to try to virtualize this or move it to a virtualized environment? And then certainly as we talk about the compatibility aspects, if it's incompatible, how are we going to remediate that if we need to? Right? Is there a patch? Is there an upgrade? Do I need to bring the developer back into the conversation? What do we need to do to remediate this app, or are these users just out of luck? And then finally, another one we certainly encourage, and I'm sure you guys have run into, is the licensing conversation. Just because you technically can do it, and technically we can get something to stream in Citrix, does it mean it's licensed properly for use in Citrix? Right? And so that's a whole different conversation from an application perspective. So now that we've figured out what we're going to build and we've analyzed our users and have a pretty good idea of what effort's underway from an application perspective, we can start talking about a rollout plan. And really, like I said, there's a couple of pieces of this. One is the solution mapping side of it in blue over here on the left. Right? We've determined the users that we're going to go after. We've figured out what applications they're going to use. And we then have been able to tie that, user group A in marketing is going to be able to go on VDI. User group B in finance is going to have to go on XenApp, or whatever that combination is. You've figured out what that mapping is. On the right side, the calendar side of this conversation, and there's a few pieces involved with that, right? Business availability. Year end for the finance guys probably means they're going to be out of commission for doing any migration work in January or whenever quarter end is, right? So there's business events that you have to take into account when you start talking about your rollout plan. And we talked to a lot of organizations that, I don't want to say overlook that, but it's like, oh yeah, we got to figure that one out. Application availability. Obviously, if you've done an analysis of the work, when are those apps going to be available on whatever platform? And some of this is just common sense. And then the last piece of that is certainly the solution availability. When are we going to have capacity built out for a VDI solution? When are those apps going to be available to go to that VDI solution? And you get into the next piece of this, and just some more detail on the solution mapping aspect of this thing. You know, the idea is you can then overlay those, and there becomes your rollout plan that you can start working off of. Right? You know when apps are going to be available. You're going to know when solutions are going to be built, when capacity is going to be built. You're going to know when users can migrate. And therefore, you can start using those components to figure out a plan and manage, you know, as things move and ebb and flow. Once you got that, you can start talking about resource planning. It was amazing how many people we had to talk to and get lined up and queued up to do whatever effort it was to get a certain solution in place in a large enterprise. Right? There's the application remediation, and I'm not going to go through this whole list. You can read through it. Right? Getting the apps ready, getting them packaged and tested. Right? Do we have the SMEs space available on most of those guys that we're aware of, and most of those SMEs for the individual apps? It's a part-time job for them, and it's not their primary job. Or we don't know who that is. Right? Who's the person, who's the SME that owns that Adobe 7 from, 2002? Probably long gone. Licensing, that's a whole different conversation. Right now you're getting your procurement and your legal guys involved, and some of those conversations can get fairly lengthy from a time perspective. Right? Can't underestimate that. Capacity planning, so you've developed your solutions that we just talked through. Now we need to talk about capacity. How do we build it up? Which data centers do we need to build it up in? Who do we need to engage to do that? How much lead time do they need? What are their processes? What are their SLAs? Those sorts of things. Client device hardware to order, all right? We figured out the user group A in marketing again. I don't know why I'm picking on user group A in marketing today, but user group A in marketing is going to go 8 weeks from now. We need to make sure that we've got somewhat of a just-in-time delivery probably, right? Who wants to sit on, who knows how many 100 boxes of thin clients or PCs or iPads, right? So you've got to figure out lead time, where this stuff's going to get delivered, who's going to procure it, those sorts of things. Who's going to configure it once it's on the network. Deployment rollout resources. Right? And so now we've got devices there. Who's actually going to flip the button for the users and make sure that their experience is a good one and they've got what they need, and they leave Friday night, come in Monday morning or whatever the case may be, and they're good to go. It was seamless. We get smiles on end users' faces. So that takes time, resources, and effort. Training, support, making sure those guys are up to speed, and then finally making sure that we've got everybody lined up and ready to go. That's a huge effort. Right, there's a lot of people, and there are others, I'm sure, depending on what organization you're dealing with, that you're going to have to line up from a resource perspective. Build out. So again, this is really all around capacity and making sure that you're building up those solutions when they need to be ready. And you can kind of see as we go through these, they may not necessarily be in this sequence, right? Some organizations do it A, B, C, others will do it CBA. But bottom line is a step, right? So the core infrastructure. Do we have the storage we need? Whether it's for hosting VDI images, maybe it's user profile storage, who knows what it is, but do we have the storage lined up? Do we have the underlying components, whether it's VDI? Do we have the servers we need? Do we have the network chassis in place? Do we have those configured, ready to go? Application packaging, do we have what those guys need to make sure they have enough equipment to package or virtualize their applications? And then ultimately, do the SMEs have something similar where they can test and validate those packaged or virtualized applications? Client device acquisition, right? Whole different conversation there. Do those guys, the procurement guys, know what they need and get it on site? The user migration prep. Making sure that when we migrate them, we know what we're going to do. Are we going to do something local in a satellite office? Are we going to pull them over the WAN? How are we going to do that? Do we have the capacity to do what the Royal guys will need to do from that perspective? Training. Do we have training in place? Training and documentation always seems to be the stuff that gets thrown in at the end. But have we taken that into account? Do we have the classes or the podcasts or whatever we're going to use to train these users on their solutions? Operational readiness. This is a big one, right? We talked about how each of the various solutions has their own OR plan, right? The support staff training. Do they know how to troubleshoot? Do they know what logs to look at? Change release schedules. Hey, you know what? We got to get this patch out for this one application or this one underlying solution. Do we understand what our processes are and who we go to and what sort of lead times they need? Incident management, monitoring, those sorts of things. What are we doing proactively to try to limit those incidents? But when they occur, what do we need to do? Who do we need to engage to make sure that we limit the impact? And then finally, from a BRDR perspective, right? We talked about maybe you're homed in one data center. What happens if the data center goes down, a network goes down, a server craps out? You know, how are we going to flip those users over? What sort of lead times does that look like? Do we test that? Application packaging, testing, sign-off, we kind of talk through that, and certainly the licensing aspect again. So there's a lot of moving parts to make sure that we've got the build-out ready to go so that we can then finally go to the next step, which is the user onboarding and migration piece. Right? This is the moment of truth. All the months and activity that we just went through is for this moment, getting the users on there, right? Making sure that they get their profile and data collected. Do we know where it is? Were we able to collect everything? Make sure we're not missing that one favorite that goes to their favorite golf site. I'm sure something business critical like that. But seriously understanding where is all their current data, what's mission critical, do we have it all? The delivery and deployment of the client device, right? Do they have their new thin client? Did we reprovision their current workstation with a thin Windows image? Did we get them their iPad? Physical setup, how are we going to do that, right? Who's going to do that? Are you going to ship thin client boxes to end users and let them plug it in with a how-to guide? Are you going to bring somebody in to do it? Or are you guys going to do it yourselves, right? So what does that final physical device setup look like? The one-off apps. I had a colleague give a presentation, and I liked his analogy. He said, you know, it's like a cupcake, right? You build you bake your cupcake, and the cake's good, and you figure out the frosting with those business-level apps. What's going to kill you are the sprinkles, right? He wants his one-off app that's the red sprinkle. This gal wants the one-off app that's the green sprinkle. That's where the challenge comes into play. How do you get the individualization, if you will, of those specific one-off apps? You're going to be able to get 80, 90, whatever the percentage is, done pretty easily. It's going to be that last, getting over that line where it comes into play. Right? That's going to be the challenge. Provisioning of those one-offs, like I said. Final data profile onboarding, right? So, okay, we've collected the data. We know where it is. We've got it. Where does it go? Right? How do we get it off that Windows XP C drive or profile drive onto a network share for, if that's where we're putting it? How do we get it into a user profile management piece? And then you get into the training aspects. Certainly you'd want to follow up, make sure they've got smiles on their faces and everything's good. And then at the end of the day, you may want to do a customer satisfaction. So that onboarding piece. And then as we alluded to earlier, now that they're onboarded, they're living the dream, they're using the new stuff, right? We're going to have to continue to manage that through normal lifecycle management processes. And so as you implement these various pieces and parts, right, you can't underestimate that lifecycle management piece. As you're bringing more and more solutions into this, right, there's a burden that does become part of the lifecycle management aspect potentially. And so that's another estimation that you need to make sure and an analysis you want to do early on. You know, and this is move, add, change. Maybe there's course corrections. That first one, hey, we had a user designated to go to VDI. You know what? It's not a good experience because of X. Let's go back and give them a Windows 8 box. Right? So you're going to have some of those users that may say, hey, you know what? We got to fix them. Maybe we've got them on the wrong solution after all. Break fix activities, the application prep doesn't go away, right? It's only a matter of days until the next application comes out that we're going to need to get prepared and tested and packaged or virtualized. Get it provisioned once it's ready to go. Asset management, all of this stuff you guys are familiar with. We have to continue to take into account. So that really brings, like I said, certainly that whole implementation life cycle. We've seen those themes really repeatedly come true, right? And talking to a lot of our largest organizations as they go through their own desktop transformation or virtualization experiences, those are the themes that we have seen. And I'd be curious, is there anything that you guys have seen that may be slightly different in terms of a major step? Or does that all seem somewhat familiar? So going on, so what I've got here are a couple of slides of learnings, suggestions, just thoughts. So we talk about the business case, and we kind of alluded to this early on. Right? Be realistic, not optimistic. Obviously, we all jump into something. We want it to go well. We want to make sure that we're going to deliver. We're going to do it to the best of our abilities. We're going to be on time and under budget. The challenge is you want to make sure your budget's where you need it. Right? So that's where I say be realistic. You know, if you think you're going to go 80%, maybe dial it down a little bit. But there's a line there. You guys are going to have to figure out what that line is for each of you. What's funny is, and where the quote comes into play underneath that is, we were guilty of this. I'll raise my hand. We were very optimistic. We started looking at our desktop transformation journey 5-6 years ago. And we were pretty conservative. We said, you know what, we're going to do POC, we're going to use thin clients on XenApp. And we did analysis, we did a pretty in-depth proof of concept, learned a lot of things, and we basically came to the conclusion that, you know what, there are use cases and application sets where this can work. And so the quote you've got is from a deck that I pulled up from, I think it was 2007, where we went to our leadership pretty high up within the organization and said, here's what our recommendation is. So that's great, we're going to go across the board. Everybody's getting it. Kind of blew the budget out of the water, and we didn't really achieve what we wanted to from an overall. Did we get 100% of 47,000 users on it? No. Wasn't a surprise, but that's where you make sure you're realistic. What is your goal? Be complete. And so what I mean by this is try to paint the grand vision. You know, look at that second slide that showed all the various pieces, parts, and give that some thought. Hey, is BYOC really part of what we want to do? Do we have MDM as a part of that? Or what are these users going to use once they come into it? They're only going to use apps that you've made available through MDM, or are you actually going to set up a Citrix infrastructure where you're going to have them come in and actually access that remotely? Right? If you're going to do that, or how are you going to manage the profile aspect of it? So you really want to kind of paint the vision, because our experience was that when you get into a place where you've identified the piece, but maybe the budget comes into play and budgets change and things get tight, and you say, wait a minute, I need X number of dollars to go out and implement Res or AppSense or pick one. Wait a minute, those dollars dried up. Well, you know, we need this as a part of the big vision to make sure that, you know, if we have the flexibility for these users that they may need flexibility to go from one solution to the other. Yeah, the money's gone. Well, don't you remember this? Well, you didn't really paint that out. So you really want to look at that grand vision, right? You're not going to implement that all simultaneously. But when you start talking dollars and cents, make sure you understand what the rationale is and how the pieces, parts are going to play together over time. And we talked about that, you know, some of this is going to be strategic. And I find myself kind of laughing at myself when I say, all right, you're really not going to look at cost savings, you're going to look at strategic direction. Well, how many projects really get off the ground that don't offer some sort of savings down the road? That's not what I'm saying. Right? What I'm saying is make sure you've got a good balance as to, hey, this is a strategy investment versus, you know, we're going to eliminate workstation expense. Applications. The easy part is building out new infrastructure. Right? We can get a server guy, we can get a Citrix guy, we can get a storage guy, we can get those guys in a room and really develop something pretty slick. It's the apps that are going to be the challenge. Right? Can you virtualize them? Are they compatible? Are we licensed? Who owns them? Who's going to remediate them? Huge effort. Find your target audience. So we talked about this early on. You know, user segmentation and application rationalization is a must. Right? You need to understand that, and the earlier the better. Right? I actually blogged on one of our internal blogs that if you have the chance to do this before your big grand business case, I would encourage that. Right? If you need to look at a tool, and I'll get to my sales slide. If you need to look at a tool that helps you do that use case analysis and the application compatibility before you put your big program together, I would almost advise trying to do that up front. Right? So you have a much better understanding of, here's what we know. We know these users are good targets for X. We know these applications are compatible with Y. It's not a swag. Multimedia. So this is a learning and a recommendation. So multimedia, certainly there have been huge strides, and I'm sure you're going to hear about it over the next 3 days around multimedia performance.